Of the business news of the day, I'm Francis Hurd, and we start with this. 14 international flights from countries at high risk of the coronavirus have been grounded at OR Tambo International Airport. Airport spokesperson Betty Maloka says only South African passengers and those with permanent residency permits are allowed to disembark. The rest will be sent back to their countries of origin. This after the announcement of a travel ban from certain countries to try and stop the further spread of the virus in South Africa. South African Airways, meanwhile, has suspended all international flights until the 31st of May. The airline has scaled down capacity in response to the low demand for air travel due to the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. The airline says it will only operate flights under circumstances where load factors and other business considerations weigh in favor of scheduling flights. SAA says assistance will only be provided to ticketed passengers. It says customers who have booked through a travel agent should contact their travel agent directly. All right, now earlier the Transport Minister Fikile Mbalula held a media conference talking about these flights coming in from high-risk countries finally being stopped as soon as they land. But a bit of confusion, who gets off, who stays on. Mbalenhle Mthethwa was there. Mbali, just start with how many flights came in today and what exactly happened. We know they were grounded and foreigners were not allowed to leave.
Good evening, Francis. Yes, indeed, it is true. We understand that there were 14 flights that landed in OR Tambo alone, 5 in Cape Town and 1 in Durban, and that brings that to a round figure of 20 international flights that landed on South African shores. And unfortunately, citizens who were not from South Africa were not allowed into the country. And essentially, we heard the Minister of Transport just giving clarity that the South African government cannot deny returning South Africans entry into the country, and essentially those returning South Africans and holders of permanent residency have been allowed into the country. However, they have had to be subjected to quarantine. Now, these are some of the regulations that have been implemented by government as well as the Transport Department in order to curb the spread of COVID-19. But to talk to us about regulations going forward that have been implemented in order to curb the spread and also to prevent people, not necessarily prevent people, but to avoid people from high-risk areas entering into the country and possibly spreading the virus. And not to say that they are, the people who come into the country outside of South Africa or not South African citizens are carriers of the virus, but this is just a precautionary measure that has been implemented by government in order to curb the spread. I'm going to be joined by South African Civil Aviation Authority CEO, Ms. Poppy Khoza, who's going to be speaking to us about the regulations. We understand that there are these flights that landed in South Africa, and I understand that civil aviations across the board, across the globe, essentially communicate with each other and also just inform each other about changes to regulations as and when they happen. Please talk to us about communication with other countries. How is it going? Were these countries or civil aviation authorities informed about these regulations before landing in the country?
So primarily, those that we will communicate with are the immediate stakeholders who are resident in South Africa. For instance, all airlines who are coming from, who are based or who have their operations in South Africa were notified about the regulations. You will appreciate that immediately the regulations are approved by the minister, they do get gazetted, and after they get gazetted, then we would normally communicate those regulations to the affected parties. And in this instance, the airlines, the Airports Authority, being Airports Company South Africa, as well as the Air Traffic and Navigation Services. So the immediate stakeholders that we ought to have notified were duly notified. We also issue what is termed a NOTAM, which is Notice to Airmen, which transmits information or necessary information to pilots, giving them further information about how the regulations are going to affect them, personnel, or the flight operations. So all those legal instruments were duly observed and communicated accordingly.
Something else that came out of this media briefing is that, the Civil Aviation Authority is going to ensure that hygienic measures are implemented consistently. What does that essentially mean?
So the regulations as approved by the Minister of Transport, which became effective on the 18th of March, empowers the Civil Aviation Authority to issue guidelines to the affected parties. To that end, we did issue guidelines to the airports, and we also issued guidelines to the airlines. But of course, ongoing communication is what we are doing. The guidelines pretty much details how the passenger, from when they get to the airport, would be processed up to the point where they board an aircraft. Of course, there are issues of hygiene control, there are issues that of disinfection and so on. So, for instance, if you're a passenger and you present yourself at check-in, what are the protocols that must be followed at that level? As you go to the screening point, what are the protocols that must be followed, as well as when you board an aircraft, including when a passenger is on board an aircraft. So those guidelines are end-to-end, from a passenger when the passenger gets into the airport, as well as when the passenger boards. So those guidelines have been issued, and the expectation from the Civil Aviation Authority, as well as the Ministry, is that those guidelines shall be implemented. Again, the primary intent of those guidelines is to ensure that we control the spread of the COVID-19.
Thank you so much for speaking to us. There you have it. That is Poppy Khoza, who is the CEO of the Civil Aviation Authority of South Africa, the department, the authority that essentially ensures that all South Africans get to their various destinations safely, and they ensure safety measures on all flights in South Africa. But, going back to the minister's press briefing, he responded to allegations and misinformation, rather, that has been spread on social media that the airport has been closed, and he's essentially said that the airport is not closed, it's fully operational. International flights from countries that are not considered to be high-risk areas of the COVID-19 virus are allowed to land in South Africa, and all flights essentially are still landing in South Africa, even though those citizens from countries considered to be high-risk areas have not been allowed to disembark on those flights, because essentially, as the department, they would like to ensure that all flights land safely. And also, with one other thing that the minister responded to is that those who are from countries that are not considered to be high-risk areas have been allowed to catch their connecting flights if need be. So the airport is essentially not closed. It is operational, while other airlines have opted to ground their flights or suspend international flights. The airport is essentially operational, and people from high-risk areas have not been allowed entry into the country, while returning South Africans have been allowed entry and have been subjected to quarantine, and they've been taken away from the airport. They're actually kept at a place not so far away from the airport to ensure that, South Africa curbs the spread of the virus. We understand that South Africa is already at 202 confirmed cases, but for now, though, it's back to you in studio.
All right, Mbalenhle Mthethwa, thank you very much. She was at that briefing by the Transport Minister earlier and speaking to the Civil Aviation Authority as well.